Welcome to this segment on sampling techniques. I thought it might be helpful to start with using our imaginations a little bit. So imagine we find that there's an increase of incidents of identity theft across the entire United States, coast to coast. And a personal security company based in Saintsville, Florida, wants to market a product that will help everyday citizens keep their personal information private and secure. But before they decide to venture into the market with this new product, they decide to conduct some surveys in the Saintsville area, asking people questions like, have you ever had your identity stolen? What worries you the most about having your identity stolen? What would help you to keep your identity protected? What would make you want to purchase a product to secure your identity? And how much would you be willing to spend on a product to secure your identity? So they asked these questions to people locally where their company was based in Florida. And they found that the people in Saintsville just weren't very concerned about identity theft, because most of them already avoid online banking, shopping online. Some of them said they don't even use banks, credit cards, ATM machines. So this particular group of people who answered the questions were saying, no, I've never had my identity stolen. I'm not very concerned. And they were probably saying that they weren't all that likely to spend a lot of money on a product. So feeling discouraged, this company decided it's too much of a risk for us to develop and market this product. So they just gave up on the idea. And so I'd like you to think for a second, do you think they should have given up on this idea? Why or why not? On the one hand, they have information from their surveys indicating that this product may not be very popular and may not make a lot of money. But what else do we know? What can we think about the way they collected their information to inform our decision? Well, I might make the argument that the particular population there in Saintsville, Florida, may be biased. In fact, again, let's use our imaginations and imagine that this particular group is of an older generation where they're not very tech savvy. Maybe they're not very aware of the dangers of identity theft. Maybe this is a low-income group that's just not likely to spend money on a product even if it would be useful. And so generally speaking, I would make the argument that this small group in Saintsville, Florida, answering the questions, they're certainly entitled to their beliefs, but they do not represent the entire United States population. And essentially, this company was thinking about making a product that could serve the whole country, and they only asked people in Saintsville, Florida, what they thought. So this leads us to the topic of sampling. So in our example of the company thinking about the identity theft protection product, the population that they had in mind was probably the entire United States. The population that their product would serve, I'm thinking, would be the whole country. Men and women, young and old, coast to coast. Now, they decided to take a sample of that population to ask questions, and they sampled people just locally. And ideally, you always want a sample that represents the entire population. In this case, the sample did not. So while they did take a sample, I would argue that it wasn't a very good one. A good sample would be representative. It would look a lot like the population that you're hoping to serve in some way. And so we like to say that for samples, the result of the study should be what we call generalizable to the population. You should be able to take the results of your sample and generalize to the greater population. You should be able to say that what this small group said represents what the larger group would have said. And they would have said it possibly if we had interviewed every single person in the United States. So in our example of Saintsville, Florida, I think we can agree that the responses given by that local community probably do not represent the responses we would have received had we asked every single person in the United States. And by the way, if we did ask every single person in the United States, we would call that a census, not a sample. So there's always a population in mind, and when you take a small group of that population and you study them, that's a sample. When you aim to speak to or address or research the entire population, we call that a census. Now, in most cases, a census is entirely unrealistic, that it's just unfathomable that you could reach the entire population. An example of when, though, it is realistic, for example, you're a student at a small college. Maybe the college only has 1,000 students total, and the college decides to employ a survey, like a satisfaction survey, to understand the students' opinions about the school. It is feasible to deliver a survey to 1,000 students. It is feasible that every single student can receive a survey. Now, they don't have to all complete it for it to be a census, but the idea is we didn't just take a sample of, say, 200 students. We decided, no, we are going to reach out to all 1,000. That would be a census. So let's look at some examples then. If you want to learn about the experiences of people who live in nursing homes, what then can we call the population? And how would you find a sample? So don't overthink this. If we're looking at people who live in nursing homes, that in fact is the population. But let's be clear, we're talking about all people who live in nursing homes. So by the way this question is designed, if you want to learn about the experiences of people who live in nursing homes, what is the population? I would say technically we're talking about people who live in nursing homes anywhere in the world. We're also making sure that we get both men and women. We're getting people of various ages, various races and ethnicities, various income statuses. And so the population here is very diverse. So how would you find a sample? Wow. Well, there's no one simple way to do that. If I asked each of you to come up with something, we would each come up with something a little bit different. But as long as our sample looks like a pretty diverse group of people, I think we're pretty well capturing the experiences of people who live in nursing homes. But again, we want to make sure that our sample is people who live in nursing homes, that we're getting males and females, we're getting young and old, we're getting different income statuses, different races, ethnicities, and different geographic locations. In contrast, though, if you wanted to learn about the experiences of women who live in nursing homes, what is the population? It's just a little bit different from before. In this case, we're still looking at different geographic locations, we're still looking at different age groups, we're still looking at different races and ethnicities, but we are only looking at women. So how would you find your sample? Likely it would be very similar to how you did it in the first question, but as you're collecting subjects for your study, you are only soliciting interest from women. Finally, if you wanted to learn about the opinions of spouses of Philadelphia police officers, what then is the population and how would you find a sample? So this one's a little bit different. So we are only looking at one geographic location, Philadelphia, and we're only looking at spouses of police officers. Keep in mind, though, Philadelphia is still a pretty large metropolitan region, so it's possible that as you're collecting your sample, that you may want to sample maybe, I'm just going to make something up. Maybe you say, I want 5 spouses from each police district. And so then you're spreading out your sample throughout all of Philadelphia. And you're not just asking about the opinions of spouses of police officers who work in, let's say, the Center City area. You're getting a more diverse group that is more representative of the Philadelphia police officers. So we went through some examples of how to collect samples without really giving them names. So let's try to do that now. So first there's random sampling, and this is usually the ideal. This is usually what a lot of researchers strive for, but it can be difficult. So this is when subjects are selected based purely on chance, that people have an equal likelihood of being chosen for the sample. And we'll say a little bit more about this on the next slide, but this reduces what we call bias in your sample. The next one is availability sampling, or sometimes called convenience sampling. And this is selecting subjects for your study based on ease or convenience. So, for example, in the little imagination exercise we did at the beginning, that company just interviewed people locally because they were available. They were nearby, so they just asked the local people of Saintsville their opinions. Then we have quota sampling, subjects selected to match particular characteristics of the population in proportional ways. So I have an example of that from my own research. I am going to be conducting research on the people who work in schools who address gender-based violence. And I want to make sure that I speak to people who work in elementary schools, high schools, and colleges. And so altogether, I'm looking for a certain number of people. 1/3 of them are going to be from elementary schools, 1/3 of them from high schools, and 1/3 of them from colleges. I'm trying to reach a quota. So once I, for example, meet my quota for high school people, I no longer need anyone from high schools to enroll. And so if someone expresses interest, I would in fact be declining their enrollment in my study. There's also purposive sampling, and this is sampling when subjects are chosen based on their unique position. So in fact, the example I just gave from my own research is also kind of an example of this, in that I am specifically approaching people who hold the position in a school of being the one to address gender-based violence issues. And so I'm not just soliciting interest from anyone who works in a school or anyone who's interested in talking to me. I'm approaching people based on their specific title. And then finally, there's something called snowball sampling. And this is where you perhaps enroll a subject in your study and you suspect that that person may be well connected to others who would be useful for your study. So you ask that subject to recommend other subjects. And this was useful in a study that we did in the Philadelphia health centers. We were working with people who are identified as HIV positive, and when they would come into the health center, we were doing a counseling intervention. And when we did our counseling intervention, we would ask them, "Hey, do you know anyone else who you think might be interested in this study?" And very often they were connected to others who would meet the criteria for enrollment in our study, and they would let their friends and coworkers and family members know this study was available to them. And so that was snowball sampling. So as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about bias. So just as an example, telephone sampling is a common practice in marketing surveys. Maybe you've even received one of these phone calls where someone wants to conduct a phone survey. And oftentimes, a sample is chosen from a list of phone numbers in a particular area code. If this happens, there are some people who are inevitably left out of this study. So maybe a company decides to conduct a survey and they start calling around and they believe they're conducting a random sample because maybe they are just randomly choosing phone numbers from this list. But there are still people who do not have a chance to be selected for this survey. For example, it misses people who don't have a phone. So therefore, they're not on the list of phone numbers, and therefore they do not have an equal chance of being selected for this survey, and their opinions then get lost. And so your sample may not represent those folks. It may also miss people who only have a cell phone that has an area code not in the region being surveyed. So for example, I live in Philadelphia. My cell phone area code is not a Philadelphia area code because I got the cell phone when I lived somewhere else. And so if a company wants to survey the Philadelphia area code, I live in Philadelphia. I represent the opinions of people in Philadelphia, but I won't be captured in this survey because my cell phone number does not match the criteria. So it also misses people who do not wish to be surveyed, including those who monitor calls on answering machines, or just don't answer phones from telephone surveyors. And that's true of most studies. You'll always miss the people who just decline to participate, and that's okay. People have every right to decline to participate. But when you are making conclusions based on the data you've collected, you need to take into consideration there was in many cases a large group of people who said, no thanks, I don't want to talk to you. And so their thoughts and feelings are not represented in the information you've gathered. And so the method of telephone sampling is just an example of one way that we can systematically exclude certain types of consumers in the area, and that introduces bias. And so any kind of conclusions that you make from a biased sample are considered not trustworthy as conclusions compared to those that we might make from a truly random sample. So just to wrap up where we've been, we talked about the difference between the sample and the population. We talked about types of sampling techniques, and then we ended by understanding how bias occurs in non-random samples.